A council estate in Elephant and Castle housed 800 working families for 60 years. Teachers, bus drivers, shop assistants, and cleaners who formed the backbone of their local community. Then the developers arrived with glossy brochures and promises of regeneration. 3 years later, the estate was demolished. In its place stands a luxury tower, where the cheapest one-bedroom flat costs £600,000. Not a single family from the original estate could afford to return. They were scattered across London, some pushed as far as Kent and Essex, their community destroyed forever. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't market forces or natural urban development. It was the result of a carefully orchestrated plan by London's property development industry to systematically remove working families from valuable land and replace them with wealthy buyers who can pay premium prices. Internal documents, planning applications, and industry conferences reveal a deliberate strategy that treats working-class communities like obstacles to be cleared rather than people to be housed. And this plan is accelerating across London, targeting every remaining area where ordinary families can still afford to live. But here's what the developers don't want you to know. The system is designed to make their displacement appear inevitable and beneficial, when in reality, it's a calculated wealth transfer from the poor to the rich on a scale that would make Victorian industrialists blush. The strategy starts with what developers call opportunity mapping, and it's far more sinister than it sounds. Property development companies employ teams of analysts whose job is to identify areas of London where working-class families live on valuable land. They use detailed demographic data, income statistics, and property value projections to create what they internally refer to as extraction zones. These are neighborhoods where land values are artificially suppressed by the presence of social housing, council estates, or affordable private rentals. The developer's goal is simple: remove the existing residents and replace them with developments that can command maximum prices. But they can't just bulldoze communities overnight. They need a systematic approach that makes the displacement appear legitimate and even beneficial. This is where the regeneration narrative comes in. Developers have learned to present their profit-seeking ventures as community improvement projects. They commission studies that highlight problems in working-class areas: poor housing conditions, lack of amenities, high crime rates, limited economic opportunities. Then they propose developments that promise to solve all these problems while creating mixed communities and affordable housing. But the affordable housing in these developments is typically priced at levels that are completely unaffordable to the people who lived there originally. An affordable one-bedroom flat might cost £400,000, which requires an income of at least £80,000 per year to qualify for a mortgage. The bus driver who earned £25,000 per year has no chance of affording it. So the developers achieve their goal of removing working families while maintaining the public relations fiction that they're improving communities rather than destroying them. The planning permission manipulation system is where developers really show their sophistication, and it's a process that most people never see or understand. Local councils are supposed to protect existing communities and ensure that new developments serve local needs. But developers have learned how to game the planning system to get approval for projects that do exactly the opposite. Here's how it works. Developers begin by purchasing small plots of land in working-class areas, often paying above market rates to encourage sales. This creates the appearance of rising property values and improving neighborhoods. They then submit planning applications for modest developments that seem reasonable and community-friendly. Maybe a small block of flats with a mix of affordable and market-rate units. Once they get approval for the initial development, the real strategy begins. They submit amendment applications that gradually increase the size, density, and luxury level of the project. They argue that changes in construction costs, market conditions, or technical requirements necessitate modifications to the original plan. Each amendment makes the development slightly more upmarket and less accessible to original residents. By the time the project is complete, it bears no resemblance to what was originally approved. But because the changes were introduced incrementally, it's difficult for local residents or councils to object effectively. The developers also exploit the affordable housing requirements that councils impose on new developments. Most London boroughs require that new residential projects include a percentage of affordable housing, but developers have learned to manipulate these requirements in ways that serve their interests rather than local housing needs. They define affordable using complex formulas based on local market rates rather than local incomes. So affordable housing in Kensington might cost £500,000, which is obviously unaffordable to anyone who actually needs affordable housing. They also use loopholes that allow them to provide affordable housing off-site or pay fees instead of actually building affordable units. A developer might get permission for a luxury development in central London by promising to build affordable housing in a completely different borough, or by paying a fee that goes into a general fund rather than providing actual homes for displaced residents. The financial engineering behind these developments reveals the true scale of wealth extraction that's taking place, and it's far more sophisticated than most people realize. Property developers don't just build and sell buildings. They create complex financial instruments that allow them to extract maximum value from land while minimizing their own risk and tax obligations. Here's how the money flows work. Developers typically use offshore companies and complex ownership structures that make it difficult to track who actually owns and profits from developments. A luxury tower in London might be owned by a company registered in the British Virgin Islands, which is owned by another company in Luxembourg, which is controlled by investors in Dubai or Hong Kong. This structure allows profits to be shifted to low-tax jurisdictions while the actual development benefits from UK infrastructure, services, and legal protections. The scale of international money flowing into London property development is staggering. Industry estimates suggest that over 60% of new luxury developments in central London are purchased by overseas buyers, many of whom never intend to actually live in the properties. They're treating London real estate like a stock market, buying properties as investments rather than homes. This inflates property values across the entire city and makes it impossible for working families to compete with international capital. But the most cynical aspect of the financial engineering is how developers structure their projects to maximize short-term profits while avoiding long-term community obligations. They build luxury developments with minimal amenities or community facilities, sell them quickly to overseas investors, then move on to the next project. There's no consideration of how these developments affect local communities, infrastructure, or housing affordability. The profits are extracted and moved offshore, while the social costs are left for local councils and communities to manage. Meanwhile, working families who have lived in these areas for generations are forced to move further and further from central London as property values rise beyond their reach. They end up paying higher transport costs, spending more time commuting, and losing connection to their communities, while developers and overseas investors profit from the land their families once called home. The regeneration displacement machine is perhaps the most sophisticated part of the developer's strategy, and it's the process that transforms entire neighborhoods from working-class communities into luxury enclaves. The word regeneration sounds positive, but in the context of London property development, it's become a euphemism for systematic displacement of existing residents. Here's how the regeneration process typically unfolds. Developers begin by identifying areas with significant social housing or affordable private rentals that are located on valuable land. They approach local councils with proposals for comprehensive redevelopment that promise to address housing problems, create jobs, and improve local amenities. The initial proposals always include commitments to rehouse existing residents and maintain community character, but the actual regeneration process is designed to make it impossible for original residents to remain in the area. The redevelopment timeline typically spans 5 to 10 years. During this period, existing residents are moved into temporary accommodation while their homes are demolished. They're told they'll be able to return when the new development is complete. But the new homes that replace their old ones are priced at market rates that are completely unaffordable to them. A family that was paying £150 per week for a council flat might find that the replacement property costs £500 per week. Even if some units are designated as affordable housing, they're typically priced at 80% of market rates, which still makes them unaffordable to people on working-class incomes. The developers argue that they can't charge less because construction costs and land values have increased during the development process. This is often true, but it's a problem the developers created by designing a luxury development in the first place. If they had built genuinely affordable housing, construction costs would be lower and original residents could afford to return. But affordable housing doesn't generate the profit margins that developers are seeking. So working families are permanently displaced, while developers and their investors capture the increased land value that the community's presence helped create over decades. The most insidious part of regeneration displacement is how it's presented as beneficial to the people being displaced. Developers claim they're providing better housing, improved amenities, and economic opportunities. But the reality is that original residents lose their homes, communities, and often their connection to central London entirely. Children are forced to change schools, families lose proximity to support networks, and communities that took generations to build are destroyed overnight. The luxury amenity inflation strategy reveals how developers artificially inflate property values by including unnecessary features that justify premium prices while excluding working families from consideration. Walk through any new development in London and you'll notice something strange about the amenities. Concierge services, private gyms, rooftop gardens, wine storage facilities, and 24-hour security. These aren't features that working families need or want. They're designed specifically to justify charging prices that exclude ordinary buyers. Here's how the amenity inflation works. Developers calculate the maximum price they can charge for properties in a given location. Then, they work backward to determine what features and amenities they need to include to justify those prices. The goal isn't to provide useful amenities to residents. It's to create an appearance of luxury that supports premium pricing. A one-bedroom flat that might reasonably cost £300,000 becomes a £600,000 property when it's part of a development with a private cinema and spa facilities. But the residents end up paying for amenities they may never use through higher purchase prices and monthly service charges that can exceed £1,000 per month. Meanwhile, the developers capture the increased land value without providing any meaningful benefit to the local community. The amenity inflation strategy also serves to create psychological separation between new developments and existing communities. When luxury developments include private entrances, separate refuse collection, and exclusive outdoor spaces, they're physically and socially isolated from surrounding neighborhoods. This makes it easier for wealthy residents to ignore the displacement of working families that their presence has caused. It also reinforces the developer's narrative that working-class areas are problems to be solved rather than communities to be preserved. But perhaps most importantly, luxury amenities create ongoing revenue streams for developers long after the initial properties are sold. Management companies, often owned by the same groups that develop the properties, charge residents monthly fees for maintaining amenities and providing services. These fees increase annually and can't be avoided by residents. So developers continue to profit from their projects for decades after completion, while working families who were displaced receive no ongoing benefit from the increased land values their communities help create. The planning loophole exploitation system shows how developers use technical regulations and bureaucratic processes to circumvent policies that are supposed to protect working families and ensure affordable housing. Local councils have numerous policies designed to prevent the displacement of existing communities and ensure that new developments include affordable housing. But developers employ specialist consultants and lawyers whose entire job is to find ways around these protections. One of the most common loopholes involves viability assessments. When councils require affordable housing as part of new developments, developers can commission studies that claim the affordable housing requirements would make their projects financially unviable. These studies typically inflate construction costs and underestimate sales revenues to show that including affordable housing would prevent the development from proceeding. The viability assessments are usually conducted by consultants with close relationships to the development industry, and they're rarely challenged effectively by council planning departments that lack the resources for independent analysis. As a result, developers routinely get permission to reduce or eliminate affordable housing requirements from their projects. Another major loophole involves the definition of affordable housing itself. Developers have successfully lobbied to expand the definition to include intermediate housing and starter homes that are priced well above what working families can afford. A starter home that costs £400,000 might technically qualify as affordable housing under planning rules, even though it requires an income of at least £70,000 per year to purchase. This allows developers to meet affordable housing quotas without actually providing housing that's accessible to people being displaced by their developments. The planning system also allows developers to make promises during the approval process that they later modify or abandon entirely. They might commit to providing community facilities, preserving local businesses, or maintaining affordable housing in perpetuity. But once planning permission is granted and construction begins, these commitments become difficult to enforce. Developers can claim that changed circumstances require modifications to their original plans, and councils often lack the legal resources to fight expensive planning disputes. By the time local residents realize that promises have been broken, the developers have often sold the project to other investors and moved on to their next opportunity. The international investment pipeline is the engine that drives property prices beyond the reach of working families, and it operates on a scale that most Londoners don't understand. London has become a global destination for wealthy individuals and sovereign wealth funds seeking to park money in stable real estate investments. But this international capital doesn't just compete with local buyers for existing properties. It actively shapes what gets built and who it's intended to serve. Here's how the international money flows work. Property developers market new London developments to overseas investors before they're even built, often through exclusive events in Dubai, Hong Kong, Singapore, and other wealth centers. These pre-sales events allow international buyers to purchase properties off-plan, often paying premiums of 20 to 30% above what local buyers would pay. The international premium pricing means that developers have no incentive to build housing that's affordable to working London families. They can make higher profits by targeting overseas wealth, so that's exactly what they do. Entire developments are sold to international investors before local buyers even know they exist. This creates artificial scarcity in the local market, while ensuring that new housing stock is priced beyond the reach of people who actually live and work in London. The scale of international investment in London property is staggering. Industry estimates suggest that overseas buyers account for over 60% of new luxury developments and around 40% of all property purchases in prime central London areas. Many of these properties are left empty for months or years, while their owners wait for capital appreciation. Meanwhile, working families who need housing can't compete with international capital and are forced into increasingly expensive rental accommodation or pushed out of London entirely. But the international investment pipeline also corrupts the planning and development process in ways that prioritize overseas wealth over local housing needs. Developers know they can sell properties to international buyers regardless of local market conditions, so they design developments specifically for overseas tastes and investment preferences. This means larger units, luxury amenities, and investment-friendly features rather than family-sized homes with practical amenities that would serve local communities. The result is that London's new housing stock is increasingly designed for people who don't live in London, while people who do live and work here find fewer and fewer housing options they can afford. The endgame of this systematic displacement is becoming clear across London, and it represents a fundamental transformation of the city from a place where working people live to a luxury commodity for global wealth. Look at areas like Battersea, King's Cross, and Canary Wharf to see where the rest of London is heading. These neighbourhoods have been completely transformed from working-class areas or industrial zones into luxury enclaves where the average property costs over £1 million. The working families who once lived there have been scattered across outer London boroughs or pushed out of the city entirely. In their place are expensive restaurants, boutique shops, and services that cater to wealthy residents rather than local communities. But the developers aren't stopping with traditional luxury areas. They're now targeting every remaining neighbourhood where working families can still afford to live. Areas like Woolwich, Barking, Tottenham, and even outer London boroughs are experiencing the same regeneration displacement process that destroyed communities in central London. The pattern is always the same. Identify areas where working families live on valuable land, propose regeneration that promises community benefits, displace existing residents during redevelopment, and replace affordable housing with luxury developments that original residents can't afford to return to. The scale and speed of this transformation is accelerating because property developers have perfected their displacement strategies and because international investment continues to flow into London real estate. Working families are running out of places to retreat to as even outer London becomes unaffordable. Many are being pushed into neighbouring counties, creating longer commutes and breaking up communities that took generations to build. The social consequences are profound and permanent. London is losing its diversity, creativity, and economic dynamism as working families are replaced by wealthy investors who often don't even live in the properties they own. Essential workers like teachers, nurses, police officers, and firefighters can't afford to live where they work, creating staffing shortages and service disruptions. Young people are giving up on London entirely, seeking opportunities in cities where they can afford housing and build careers. And the communities that made London's neighbourhoods vibrant and distinctive are being replaced by sterile luxury developments that serve as investment vehicles rather than homes. The developer industry's own conferences and publications reveal just how deliberate and coordinated this displacement strategy really is. At industry events like MIPIM and the London Property Alliance conferences, developers openly discuss strategies for optimizing land value and improving demographic profiles in ways that make clear they're talking about removing working-class residents and replacing them with wealthy buyers. They use euphemistic language like placemaking and community enhancement, but the substance of their discussions focuses on maximizing profits by targeting areas where land values are under-optimized due to the presence of affordable housing. Internal industry reports describe working-class neighborhoods as opportunity zones and value creation opportunities. They identify specific council estates and affordable housing areas as targets for acquisition and redevelopment. They track demographic changes and income levels to measure the success of their displacement strategies. And they share best practices for navigating planning regulations and community opposition to ensure their projects can proceed, regardless of local concerns. These aren't market forces or accidental displacement. This is a coordinated industry strategy to systematically remove working families from valuable land across London. The developers have turned housing, which should be a basic human right, into a wealth extraction mechanism that transfers money from working families to property investors and international capital. And they've done it while convincing many people that their displacement activities are actually beneficial urban regeneration. The scale of this wealth transfer is enormous. Property developers and their investors have captured billions of pounds in land value increases that were created by the communities they've displaced. Working families who lived in these areas for decades receive no compensation for the wealth their presence helped create. Instead, they're forced to move to areas with longer commutes, worse services, and higher living costs while developers and overseas investors profit from the communities they've destroyed. The resistance to this systematic displacement is growing, but it faces enormous challenges because the property development industry has captured much of the political and planning system that should be protecting working communities. Local councils are often dependent on property developers for tax revenue and economic development, creating conflicts of interest when developments threaten existing communities. Many council officials and politicians have close relationships with the development industry, or go on to work for property companies after leaving public service. This creates a revolving door between the public sector and the industry that's supposed to be regulated. Meanwhile, working families who are being displaced often lack the time, money, and legal expertise to fight sophisticated development proposals. They're facing well-funded property companies with teams of lawyers, consultants, and public relations specialists who know how to navigate planning processes and overcome community opposition. The information asymmetry is enormous. Developers have detailed knowledge of planning law, property values, and financial structures, while communities are trying to understand complex technical documents in their spare time while working full-time jobs and caring for families. But despite these challenges, community groups across London are beginning to organise and resist the displacement machine. They're demanding genuine affordable housing rather than luxury developments with token affordable units. They're challenging viability assessments and exposing how developers manipulate costs to avoid affordable housing requirements. And they're building political pressure for planning reforms that would prioritise local housing needs over developer profits. The fight for London's future is ultimately about whether the city will remain a place where working people can live, or whether it will become a luxury commodity available only to global wealth. The property developers have a clear plan to price out every working family and extract maximum value from London's land and communities. But their plan is only succeeding because not enough people understand what's happening and organise to stop it. The systematic displacement of working families isn't inevitable. It's the result of policy choices that prioritise property profits over people's housing needs. Different choices are possible, but they require recognising that London's housing crisis isn't an accident or a side effect of development. It's the intended outcome of a deliberate strategy by property developers to transform London into a luxury commodity for global wealth, while pushing out the working families who built and sustained the city's communities for generations.